parts of South Asia have some of the highest numbers of forcibly displaced people worldwide. Afghanistan is one of the world's largest refugee origin countries. Due to the long civil war there and the Taliban's resurgence in 2021, there are about 5.5 million Afghan refugees worldwide, with the vast majority in neighboring Iran and Pakistan. Meanwhile, another 4 million people are internally displaced within Afghanistan. But these countries are also some of the most vulnerable to the impacts of climate change, and natural disasters hit hard. In 2022, massive floods in Pakistan submerged a third of the country and displaced about 8 million people. Those kinds of disasters fall on refugees and natives alike. In some cases, the conflict in Afghanistan has exacerbated the impact of droughts and floods in that country and across the region. When climate challenges come on top of conflict, more people are left vulnerable and are likely to flee. This is Changing Climate, Changing Migration. This is a podcast produced by the Migration Policy Institute that helps make sense of how climate change and migration intersect. My name is Julian Haddam. I'm your host and the editor of MPI's online magazine, The Migration Information Source. To walk me through some of the dynamics in Afghanistan and Pakistan, I'm speaking today with the researchers Nasrat and Maryam Abbasi, who have spent a lot of time focusing on these countries and the interaction between climate change and migration there. Thank you two so much for coming on the podcast today. I'm thrilled to have you.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks so much, Julian.
Let's start out by getting a lay of the land, so to speak. What are the major environmental threats that people are facing in this part of the world? Is it drought or floods or what? And how are those disasters displacing people or causing them to migrate?
In Pakistan, well, there are two sorts of major categories when it comes to internal displacement, and in very few cases it's international migration too. One is slow onset events and fast onset events, and it does include, of course, lots of event has to do with flooding, glacial lake outburst floods in the northern area of Pakistan, landsliding too. A lot of landsliding is affecting people to migrate in Gilgit-Baltistan and surrounding areas, and sea level rise in areas of Karachi and around those areas, and drought in areas of Sindh, which is affecting quite a long time now. And another emerging from past few years is heat wave. It is causing people to migrate, and every year it's maximum temperature is 55 degrees Celsius in Pakistan. It has been observed in few areas.
Oh, wow.
For example, Jacobabad, and temperatures are really high in urban areas too. So that forces people to migrate from one place to another place, and we can dive into later on that those are either a temporary migration, in some cases it's permanently displacing people.
It's similar in Afghanistan, Nasrat, or is it a different situation?
Yeah, in the context of Afghanistan, it's to some extent, similar, but also there are some differences. For example, in the case of Afghanistan, the major environmental threats include water scarcity, droughts, floods, for example, in eastern or northern regions of Afghanistan. And also, there are harsh winter in some provinces in Afghanistan, as well as rising temperature. So, and also earthquake, for example, in 2022 in Paktika province, there was an earthquake, and some people lost their life. So these environmental issues, they have caused displacement in Afghanistan. People migrate from one place to another place because Afghanistan is an agriculture-dependent country. So these issues affect, the agriculture, they affect their income. So to survive, they want to migrate and leave their places of origin from one part of the country to another part of the country. But there are also some cases of international migration or cross-border migration, and that includes mostly towards Iran and Pakistan. So but most of these kind of climate-induced migrants are internal and within Afghanistan.
And you mentioned the kind of high degree of reliance on agriculture, which kind of leads me to my next question, which is to what degree these countries are vulnerable to particular climate-related impacts above and beyond the fact that the impacts occur, right? I mean, it seems to be the case that many people in Afghanistan rely on agriculture, live in rural areas. There's also lots of population growth, right? Is there also poor infrastructure? I mean, what are the other factors that go into this above and beyond the fact that climate change and climate impacts exist? You can start with Afghanistan and then go to Pakistan.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a good point. In the context of Afghanistan, for example, it's not only the climate change itself, but there are other factors. For example, the geographical location of Afghanistan, because Afghanistan has an arid and semi-arid climate, and also there is low annual rainfall, and also there is weak governance in Afghanistan, which has also, affected the overall situation, and also poor water management in the country. So these are some other factors in addition to climate change impacts or the threats that I mentioned earlier.
Yeah, with the context of Pakistan, I would say governance is a major challenge in Pakistan because we have 18th Amendment to the Constitution of Pakistan a decade ago, more than a decade ago now, and that has given the power to have more power to provinces related to environment, in addition to other areas as well, and that kind of gives more responsibility to provinces instead of federal government to work on environment related issues. Still, there is like policy gaps related to climate change and migration and environmental issues, and institutional infrastructure is not so strong in every province, to say so. And another big issue is, of course, capacity building. Human resources, you would see another issue in Pakistan because in every institution there are very less people to deal with these crises. And the biggest issue after governance is the funding issue from international and partners, because Pakistan is repetitively hit by flood, even in 2022, and now we are facing and experiencing, and there is a danger of scarcity this summer, water scarcity in Pakistan, because we received very less rainfall this winter. So that combines and multiplies the issue when it comes to these crises.
And we haven't yet mentioned conflict, war, which I think sadly is recurrent features, particularly in Afghanistan, which has faced a series of wars for multiple decades, including the Soviet invasions in the 1970s and 1980s, the more recent U.S.-led invasion, and then the Taliban's return to power in 2021. I guess how does conflict fit into this mix of conflict and environmental issues, particularly in Afghanistan? But then also there are many refugees and forcibly displaced people from Afghanistan and Pakistan who are also affected by, for instance, those 2022 floods. I think had a major impact on Afghan refugees in Pakistan. I guess Nasrat, can you talk about the role of conflict with combining with these other things in Afghanistan, and then we can turn to Maryam about what the ramifications of that from Pakistan as well.
Yes, conflict had a role. Unfortunately, because of the conflict in decades of war, as you mentioned, irrigation systems were damaged or devastated in the country. Especially, the physical infrastructure were destroyed at large extent. So these destruction and damages, also contributed negatively, forcing people, to migrate, and also affected rural people to stay in their place of origin, because when there is no physical infrastructure, when there is irrigation system is affected, then people do not stay there for the agriculture purposes. So that's why they leave their place of origin and they migrate either internally or internationally. So yes, conflict unfortunately had a role in the situation.
When it comes to conflict, the research so far in Pakistan is very minimal, and the literature tells so far that the conflict I have read and viewed is in terms of natural resources. So when people migrate from one place to another place, there is competition of resources among the migrants and the people who are already living here in destination areas. So that kind of puts pressure on environmental sources, for example, water and job market, and of course the salaries and the labor market. That kind of changes because most of the people who migrate from one place to another place, they don't have like a lot of skill set, and they end up doing like labor work in the destination area. So that kind of creates conflicts at small levels in Pakistan too, but there's not enough literature to claim like bigger numbers.
It is true too that kind of Afghan refugees displaced for whatever reason, including by war, are some of the people particularly impacted in Pakistan because presumably they have lost many of their possessions, their capacity to respond, that they arrive in Pakistan and then other environmental impacts impact them. That is also a case, right? Can you talk about the Afghan refugees in Pakistan, what kind of impact they have, or how they are impacted rather?
Yeah, probably Nasrat would have more insight
Yeah.
on that because I haven't really honestly explored that Afghani migrants in Pakistan area. But I have observed when I was growing up because I was quite young when this mass migration happened to Pakistan. And what I have observed is that with the migration of migrants, I'm sure they face like lots of hardships, like every in general migrant or environmental migrant face, and that is applicable to all the migrants, I believe. But what I have observed that with this penetration, there was huge challenge to the Pakistani government and institutions related to waste management issues, and that contributed to urban flooding a lot because
Mm,
most of the Afghans also settled on waterways which were naturally planned in the city plans. For example, around Islamabad, I have seen because that's the place surrounding it. That's the place I lived and
mm.
observed. So I observed that there was this urban flooding and waste management issue, which was quite a challenge for Pakistani government.
Yeah, that's true. As Maryam mentioned, so yeah, Afghan refugees in Pakistan, they were also affected by climate change impacts, such as floodings, because Afghan refugees who are living in refugee camps in Pakistan during the recent floods, they were affected. Their
Yeah.
camps were affected, and also they lost some of the assets that they had. So they were in a very vulnerable situation, and also when it comes to access to resources, that was also like limited for many of them, depending on their status, whether they were documented or undocumented in Pakistan.
I want to return to that question in a second about legal status. I think that's an important one. But I guess we mentioned earlier some of the government initiatives or government policy, especially in Pakistan. But I'm also curious in Afghanistan. I guess to what extent is there an interest by government or policymakers or people in charge to address some of these environmental issues and to mitigate or adapt to these changes? And there's just not the resources to do so. Or are there resources to do so and people are making progress, or is there just not an interest? I guess what are the let's start with Pakistan, then we can go to Afghanistan. But what is the policy response?
Well, with the passage of time, now there is an aptitude in the government to accept policies and inputs around environmental and climate change issues because repetitively, we have seen that Pakistan is facing climate crisis one after another. So far, the policies are good on documents, but as I said, there are like lots of governance issues. But as far as the policies are concerned, we have like really good policies at federal level. The Climate Change Act, then this has also to do with Clean Air Act too, because people do migrate, to cleaner areas because of bad air quality in
Yeah.
Pakistan too. And at provincial level, I would say there is mention of like climate-induced displacement, internal displacement, those kind of terminologies in provincial level governments
Mm-hmm.
when they formulated their environmental policies. But as far as my analysis goes, Punjab government has really good insights related to climate-induced migration and internal displacement. They have like plans where they were talking about managing climate-induced migrants in their policy documents. That has not yet been implemented because of various reasons. For example, capacity building, human resource issue, and funding issues, and there are lots of other issues in that area too. There's mention of these terminologies and acceptance in policies documents of Sindh, Balochistan, and Khyber Pakhtunkhwa provinces too. But there is not much which is done practically so far because at the end of the day, our governments are stuck with finances, because they lack resources to really manage those migrants, and the population is increasing day by day in Pakistan
Yeah.
too, and managing those population and providing livelihood opportunities to people in rural areas, it's not there. And there is this increasing trend of, where people are switching from traditional businesses to, job market or other businesses in urban areas. For example, there are lots of farmers and their kids are not interested in farming anymore because they are rapidly be affected by climate change, these floods and droughts and water scarcity. So they prefer doing jobs now or small businesses instead of growing crops on their field. There is lots which needs to be done, but I would say that there is slow progress on the side of implementing the policies which are existing in Pakistan. But there is huge gap too which needs to be implemented and which needs to be incorporated. For example, the voices of climate migrants and their hardships and how their migration process can be made better because they come across with health crisis too during migration process. So how they can best accommodate those, how can they provide them opportunities in destination areas when they migrate from one place to another place, how social security network can be improved for those migrants. So these are a few areas where our government needs to work more.
So yeah, in the context of Afghanistan, there is also very limited interest by the current Taliban administration. There were some policies by the former Afghan government, but unfortunately, since the takeover of Taliban in August 2021, the development aid has been almost completely halted.
Yeah.
And also, Afghanistan since 2021 does not have access to climate funding. So that's a big challenge for the country. And also technical expertise. That's another issue. Since the takeover of the Taliban, many senior people or senior staff of Ministry of Disasters, NEPA, National Environmental Protection Agency in Afghanistan, and in many other public institutes, they left Afghanistan. So there is lack of funding. So there is lack of technical expertise in Afghanistan at the moment, because the current Taliban administration is not recognized internationally. So there's a big issue. So that's why there is very limited interest in capacity when it comes to climate adaptation schemes or programs or projects or climate resilience projects in Afghanistan.
Has the Taliban ever expressed any interest in climate resilience projects? Which I guess is to say, even if the funding and the international development support were there, would the Taliban kind of assist in partnership with that? Or I don't know if they have kind of made any comments or discussed climate issues as part of the kind of their governance structure.
What I have heard from the media, they say, yeah, environment or climate change is a big issue and we need funding. So that's why they say, yeah, and we should be recognized by the international community so that we should have access, to funding.
Yeah.
And there are civil society organizations, relevant civil society organizations in Afghanistan. They are also like advocating for Afghanistan to have access to funding, because the funding has stopped, and this is not, punishing the Taliban government, but this is unfortunately punishing all Afghans in the country. So that's why there are some civil society organizations. They are advocating, for the international community to help Afghanistan guarding the climate finance or funding issues. Yeah, because climate change is now a major issue in Afghanistan, and it's a growing problem in the country, and it's affecting almost all Afghans directly or indirectly.
I wanted to ask one kind of final question, returning to this issue that you mentioned earlier, Nasrat, about legal status and documentation. In the last year or so, since 2023, the government of Pakistan has also launched something of a crackdown of Afghans and others who are in the country without authorizations or without refugee status. There's been some criticism of this from rights groups and UN agencies, but something like 800,000 Afghans who were living in Pakistan have reportedly either been deported or returned on their own volition to Afghanistan. And Iran, which is the world's other major host of Afghan refugees, has announced something kind of a similar policy without commenting on that policy directly, although you can if you like. I guess when refugees and other migrants return to Afghanistan, what situation do they find themselves in? Are they end up more vulnerable to the impacts of climate change because of this kind of back and forth movement? Or I guess what are the repercussions of those kinds of returns?
Yes, as you mentioned, Julian, deportation or return by some Afghans by their own willing happens at the moment, but there are more cases of deportations, as we have seen and we hear from media. So when they come to Afghanistan, they face a lot of challenges, like housing is one of the big issue, because many of these returnees, they don't have access to housing. And another issue is like access to basic services as well. Health, for example, education, and so on. So they also face the issue of employment, for example. They because many of these people, they spend most of their life, or some of them the entire their life in either in Iran or in Pakistan. So when they return to Afghanistan, so that's very difficult for them to reintegrate themselves and also to have access to employment opportunities, because the employment situation is already affected in Afghanistan badly. They face these kind of issues, and also on the top of these issues, they face climate change impacts. For example, most of them, they end up living in informal settlements or in places which are exposed to high risks of climate change impact. For example, floods, landslides, and so on. So they are facing a lot of issues: employment, access to basic services, climate change impacts, and so on. But there are no necessary measurements for them or support available to them, because of the reasons that I mentioned earlier. The government or the administration is not recognized in Afghanistan. There is funding issues as well to support these returnees.
Maryam, I want to turn to you very, very the last word about people displaced in Pakistan by the climate and environmental impacts. What situation do they find themselves in? Do many people return to their origin community after a long time, or do they tend to migrate for good? What are the impacts on these displaced people, and what kind of future do they have for them in Pakistan?
There is a huge challenge of settlement, of course. If they don't have social safety networks in the destination areas, they feel stranded because they need to find housing and they end up living in informal settlements. And they have issues of finding jobs at new places because they don't have right skill sets and they don't have guidance either. So they get exploited by the market, of course. And when they migrate, most of these people are economically vulnerable too. So they migrate with their livestock. Most of migrants migrate with their livestock, so they have to sell those livestock on the way because they can't feed them or give them water, so they have to sell like on cheaper rate. Most of the people they go back when the situation gets kind of I shouldn't use word normal, but for them it's the new normal to keep facing these crises. When situation turns normal, they go back to their original area. And there have been cases when I conducted my research in 2019 in areas of Muzaffargarh and Tharparkar, there were some cases of permanent migration to people migrated to cities and they never went back to their area of origin.
We're just about out of time, so I think we'll have to leave the conversation there. But thank you two so much for coming on. This was a really valuable discussion, and I really appreciate hearing your thoughts. Thank you for your time.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Julian.
Nasrat Syed is an independent researcher who spent time in academia and with the UN system and also formerly worked with Afghanistan's Ministry of Rural Rehabilitation and Development. Maryam Abbasi is a PhD scholar at the University of Vermont and an advisory member to the state of Vermont's Environmental Justice Council. She previously spent several years with the Pakistani think tank, the Sustainable Development Policy Institute. Thank you for listening to Changing Climate, Changing Migration. We've got more episodes on the way, so make sure you subscribe to the podcast on your platform of choice so you can listen as soon as they come out. And if you like what you hear, please leave us a review. That makes it easier for other people to find us. In our archives, you can find episodes focusing on climate migration in all parts of the world, including South America, East Africa, Northern Europe, and more. Find them online at migrationpolicy.org/podcasts. And subscribe to the free Migration Information Source newsletter to catch all of the latest migration insights from my colleagues at MPI and other experts. This episode of Changing Climate, Changing Migration was produced by Elizabeth Navarro. Michelle Middlestat provided editorial insight, and Lisa Dixon provided additional assistance. Our theme music is Touch by Patrick Patricios. My name is Julian Haddam. I'll see you next time.